where he was responsible for overseeing the 2004 re-election project, and he'll be telling us about that later today in our session. Mr. Alan Lowe, Director of the George W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum. Mr. Lowe has worked in National Archives for close to 2 decades. He has helped to oversee 12 presidential libraries, and he served previously as interim director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York. Before joining the Bush Presidential Library, he led the building and development of the Howard H. Baker Center for Public Policy, and has now returned to the National, and then became executive director of the Center for Public Policy. He also worked as an archivist at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, and then transferred to the Office of Presidential Libraries in the National Archives. Our third speaker, Peter Baker, is our Joseph G. Astman Distinguished Conference Scholar and the author of several books, including, most pertinent for us today, Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House. He is the New York Times chief White House correspondent and joined the New York Times in 2008, I guess during the presidential campaign. Previous to that, served for 20 years at the Washington Post, where he covered the presidencies of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. I must tell you that in our decision to invite Peter to be the Joseph Astman Scholar, this was not a hard choice. This is a 653-page turner of a book. The students in our Understanding the George W. Bush Presidency seminar have had no complaints, am I right, students, about the reading of they've been assigned. I see you smiling, Tom. I know you're caught up. But I should say that when we began sending invitations for this conference, I spoke with a senior public official who said, if you really want someone to give an authoritative assessment of the presidency, you should try to get Peter Baker. I don't know if you can, but I said, well, actually I emailed him and he already said yes. So I think it's a sign to just Peter, despite his busy schedule, his dedication to scholarly assessments of the presidency, and so just a personal note there. Thank you, Peter. We're going to, I think I said we begin with asking you to speak about the key issues and debates about the Bush presidency, asking Mike Nelson to talk about the 2004 re-election project and how we study presidencies, particularly this one, and then Alan Lowe to comment about the archival sources on the Bush presidency. How many emails are there? When will the material be released? And how will those shape our assessment? So I'll ask each of you to speak. We'll have discussion, and then we'll have some time for questions. Thank you. Peter, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, good. Listen, thank you very, very much for having me. I can't tell you how much of an honor I think it is to be here, especially on this panel with Michael and Alan. What a great pairing. You're going to hear two very serious, smart people, and I'm going to lead you into them with a little discussion. I want to thank Meena, who put together just a fabulous set of discussions here, great list of speakers. I want you to come to every single session if you can, and ask questions when you get a chance, be probing, be tough. And I want to thank President Rabinowitz. I want to thank Peter Calico. What a tradition you have fostered here, one that's so important to our country. And I as somebody who's followed only 3 presidents, it's a great treat to be part of it. So thank you very much. It's very appropriate that we're talking about President Bush's administration and his legacy and the meaning of his time in office today, because unlike many of the presidents we've seen, I think, in modern times, for good or bad, and we can argue about that, I think we will argue about that a little today, no one, I think, would disagree that it was a very consequential presidency, a presidency that continues to reverberate even today. What do you see in the headlines of the newspapers even as we speak? What to do in Iraq with the group called ISIS, which is basically a metamorphosis of the people that were fighting during President Bush's time in office. What to do about a resurgent Russia. What are the limits of surveillance versus liberty in a modern society at war with terrorism. What to do about immigration. the limits of executive power, all of these topics that we are writing about, the Iran negotiations that are going on right now, possibly to a culmination, which basically started in a somewhat different format in the last administration. All of these things have their roots in the presidency of George W. Bush, and therefore, to understand what's happening today, we have to understand what happened then. There's a context to everything that happens in one presidency. They're not disassociated from each other. And so I find the Bush presidency to be endlessly fascinating. I think today you'll hear talk about so many different elements of it. Iraq obviously is always going to be, I think, a central point of that, but there's education, there's the PEPFAR program, there's what to do about entitlements, the tax cuts, the Hurricane Katrina, the financial crisis at the end. So many things happen in this administration. That's why I use the title Days of Fire. It took from President Bush's second inaugural address when he's speaking to the nation in 2005. And he's mentioning 9/11 as sort of the central moment of his first term, and he doesn't actually do it directly. He does it a somewhat more elliptical way under Michael Gerson's pen. He refers to it as a day of fire, and the conceit of the book is they were all days of fire. There were so many things that happened during this 8 years that were important to the country, that were a challenge for this particular president. Just think about it, war, terrorism, financial collapse, natural disasters, politics, all the things that happened. In fact, at the very end, President Bush was at the White House one day. He was giving away some awards, some medals was to Morgan Freeman, the actor. And President Bush was giving his introduction up there, and he recalled that Morgan Freeman had been a president himself in a movie, Deep Impact, and President Bush kind of drifts away from the script, and he says, yeah, that's the one where a comet almost hits and destroys the planet. He says, that's about the only thing that hasn't happened in the last 8 years. And he sits down afterwards, and Condoleezza Rice is sitting next to him, and she leans over and whispers, don't jinx it, we've got a couple weeks left. And you can imagine how it must have felt, right? Because in fact, all of these things had happened during 8 years, some of which, President Bush has only himself to blame, arguably, and some of which were not, were crises not of his own making. Either way, it was an extraordinary 8 years that deserves the kind of study that we're going to have today. Now, my book focused a lot on, or used as a narrative arc, the relationship between the president and vice president in this particular administration. Dick Cheney obviously played a role that was different than previous vice presidents had played. He had what he called a different understanding with President Bush. He wasn't just going to go to funerals and fundraisers, which is what a lot of them had done. Now, saying he was going to have a bigger role isn't saying too much, because the history of the vice presidency is one of, not a great one, right? John Adams said it was never been invented a more insignificant office for man to hold. Thomas Marshall, who was vice president, Woodrow Wilson, said the famous story, right? There are two brothers, one went to sea, one became vice president, neither was heard from since. John Garner said, what did he say? It wasn't worth a bucket of warm spit.
That's the G-rated version.
That's the G-rated version. Historians argue about what he really said. It really wasn't until Walter Mondale that a vice president even had an office in the West Wing. Imagine that. Up until then, vice presidents didn't even have an office anywhere near the president. They weren't part of an administration. And in this last 30 years since Mondale, each vice president has had a larger and larger role up until Vice President Cheney. In fact, I remember interviewing Joe Biden when he was about to be sworn in as vice president, and he said something I've never heard a politician say. He says, I'm going to be less powerful than the last guy. And he bragged about it. But in fact, what we found in doing some research was that the story is more complicated than the mythology, right? The mythology is you have a powerful vice president who was manipulating the president, and really he was really driving the trains, and that's what was happening through 8 years. And the story is so much more interesting and more complicated than the cartoon version. There's no question that Cheney was a dominant figure inside that administration early on. There's no question he understood how power was used, and President Bush gave him great latitude, no question about it. But it obscures the reality to sit there and say, aha, therefore that was the puppet master. Over time, over 8 years, that relationship changes, it evolves. President Bush begins to move away from some of the things that Vice President Cheney is advocating, and by the end of their time in office, they're actually on the opposite sides of most of the big issues that are coming up in front of them, whether it be Iran, Iraq, Russia, federal spending, gay rights, climate change, gun rights, Harriet Miers, Donald Rumsfeld, they're Syria, they're basically fighting on all sorts of things up to the very end when they actually have this sort of climactic disagreement over what to do about Scooter Libby. Scooter Libby, of course, had been the Vice President's Chief of Staff, convicted in the CIA leak case, not of the leak itself, but of perjury and obstruction of justice. And Vice President Cheney wanted President Bush to give him a pardon. He felt it was an illegitimate prosecution. He felt it was bogus. He felt it was political. It was really, an out-of-control prosecutor aiming at him, that is, the Vice President, and Libby had taken the fall for something that basically, in his view, amounted to no more than a disagreement of memories. But President Bush didn't want to do that. He didn't much like pardons to begin with. He thought it was a process that was screwed up because people with great access would have the ability to get something that other people couldn't get. So didn't much like pardons to begin with, and the idea of here's a person with the ultimate access asking for what amounted to a special favor, and he said no. And the Vice President says to him, "You're leaving a good man on the field of battle," and it was a cutting remark that sort of symbolized their break over a lot of the things that had happened over that 8 years. And I tell that story because I think that it reminds us that we don't really understand a lot of what happens inside a White House, or at least not as simply or clearly as we think we do. And it's worth taking time after it's over to go back and interview the people, to look through the documents that Alan will be processing and giving to us over time, to read the studies that Michael and his colleagues will produce as we get more distance and more information comes available. And I think our understanding of every administration evolves appropriately so over time, and both because we get more information and we have more understanding of what happened, and because the context of the moment helps us put it in a different perspective. So with that, I think this is a great way to sort of open the conversation and go from there.
Thank you, Peter. Let's, Mike.
Thank you so much, Meena. I hope you all appreciate here, I think you do, what a treasure you have in Meena Bose, and how highly she is regarded in the national community, international community of people who study the American presidency. Alan Lowe, you're still going to hear from him, but the Bush Library that he directs is just an outstanding facility, and if you ever have occasion to go to Dallas, and there's a lot of good reasons to go to Dallas, be sure to put that on your travel plans. Peter Baker, over the years I've written a lot of book reviews for a lot of different publications, but I don't think I've ever done something I did when I reviewed Peter Baker's book, Days of Fire, for the Political Science Quarterly, and that is, I went out of my way to put a sentence in there that could be used as a blurb. And what it said in essence was, Peter Baker, having written the best book on the Clinton impeachment, has now written the best book on the Bush presidency. And I think that's going to be true for quite a few years. It's also good to be back at Hofstra personally. The last time I was part of one of these conferences, and this is my fault, the subject was not a president, but somebody who, in many ways, introduced show business into presidential politics, and that was the conference on Frank Sinatra in 1998, I think. And a wonderful book came out of that, edited by Stan Pugliese, I think,
Yes.
that I was thrilled to have a chapter in on Sinatra and presidential politics. But today we're doing something that is more serious. How you write about a presidency is influenced by all the things that we've heard about so far today. The contemporary coverage, the memoirs that come out, the scholarly assessments that come out, and of course you've got the documents that are being processed at every presidential library, and with special intensity now at the George W. Bush Library. But A couple things. One is people in administrations now are writing down fewer things because, frankly, fear of subpoena. And no presidents anymore are tape recording meetings or conversations in the White House. We have extensive tape recordings, obviously, from the Nixon presidency, but also from the Johnson and Kennedy presidencies and some from the FDR. That's not going to happen again. So in many ways, the written record, as crucial as it is not all the record that, that one would like. And so here's where something called oral history comes into play. And I've gotten very interested in this. The gold standard for years now of oral histories of outgoing administrations has been the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. And their interviews, and I've been involved in many of them, they last on average a day and a half. They bring in people from the White House, from the cabinet, from the congressional leadership. They bring in world leaders, interview these individuals extensively about their experiences within and their observations about the administration of the president with whom they served. The interviews are audio recorded, not video recorded. They are transcribed. The transcript is sent to the people who are interviewed, who then can review it and edit it and even redact parts of it. And then some years later, those transcripts are revealed. And last November at the Clinton Library, about half those Clinton interviews were released, and they really are a treasure trove. It's easy to find them. Just Google Miller Center, Clinton oral history, or some combination of those words, and you can read those interviews. Now, when the George W. Bush Foundation decided to locate its presidential center and its library on the campus of Southern Methodist University in Dallas, kind of SMU's institutional response to this new presence on in their community was to create something called the Center for Presidential History. And you'll be hearing from Jeffrey Engel, who's the director of that center, later in this conference. Wonderful scholar of diplomatic history. And part of the center's mission was to do what they call collective memory projects, oral history of a kind. And the first collective memory project they took on was the George W. Bush presidency. And if you go to the website, again, easy to Google, SMU Collective Memory Project, you'll see there are about a half dozen of these underway, one of which has been released and the website is available, and that's one I ended up doing because most of these interviews, there's one on the surge, for example. There's one on faith and its place in the George W. Bush presidency. Most of them, instead of doing the whole administration, as the Miller Center at UVA does, most of them take on an aspect or a decision or an event in the presidency and then try to get a lot of different people to give their inside perspectives on that. These interviews are video recorded and not reviewed, by the way, by the people who are interviewed. They sort of sign away the rights to the center when they do the interview. And we released one. I say we. I'm affiliated with it, but obviously not there all the time. But we released one, which was my idea, which they liked, which was to do an oral history, a collective memory study of the 2004 election. And the idea was not to wait, but rather to release these interviews, the video and the written transcript, and a lot of other stuff, supplementary articles and timelines and so on a website, roughly in conjunction with the 10th anniversary of that election, which of course was last November. These interviews are video recorded. They are posted immediately. So it's a different way of doing oral history in addition to being a different slice of each administration. For the 2004 project, and I've still got a couple interviews left to do in about 3 weeks from now, we talked with people involved in the Bush campaign and the Bush White House, Ken Millman, for example, Mike Shannon, et cetera. We talked with people involved in some of the Democratic campaigns. You remember there was a fight for the Democratic nomination that year, so we talked with Joe Trippi, who was the main guy in the Howard Dean campaign, Mark Mellman and Bob Shrum, who got involved in the John Kerry campaign, which ended up being the Democratic nominee. Talked with some scholars who studied that election and more generally study aspects of campaigning, like John Gear, kind of the impresario of studies of negative campaigning, who's at Vanderbilt. Journalists who covered the campaign, notably Dan Balls of the Washington Post. 18 interviews currently, soon to be 20 or 21. Looking at that election from different points of view. This is not the authorized George W. Bush version of what happened in 2004, but rather a lot of different voices from a lot of different players, observers, and participants. And the most fun, in the sense of because you do a lot of preparation for these interviews, and so as an interviewer, you don't get a whole lot of surprises. But the most surprising, and therefore the most fun for me, was interviewing Vice President Cheney. And as he talked about the process through which he was tapped as George W. Bush's running mate in 2000. Remember, Bush had appointed him to run the process of finding a running mate. And when he ended up being the running mate, a lot of people said, well, obviously he steered the process toward himself. And what I came to conclude, and talking with Cheney sort of solidified this, was no, that Bush, in telling Cheney, here's the kind of guy I want you to find. Somebody with experience in Congress, somebody with experience in the executive, somebody with experience in business, and so on. In telling Cheney to find that guy, he was essentially telling Cheney that there was nobody else who would be acceptable to him but Cheney himself. In other words, my sense is not that Cheney sort of maneuvered onto the ticket in 2004, but that Bush maneuvered Cheney onto the ticket in 2000, I'm sorry. This was not somebody who had any interest in electoral politics. Building on what Peter said, what makes Cheney exceptional among all the modern vice presidents who have done so much to enhance the office is that from day one, it was clear that Cheney had no ambition to run for president himself, which in some ways governs the way he conducted himself as vice president. He was once asked, your approval rating is something like 23%. What do you have to say to that? He said, what do I care? I'm not, that's not the standard by which I measure myself. Anyway, my advice to all of you, because it's a fun website, is, again, just project, a combination of any 5 hours, get enjoy watching the interviews. The one thing in the last year, again, a lot of his president was Senator John Edwards of North Carolina. And Cheney said, and he based this not on what's come out about Edwards since then, but he based this on his low regard for Edwards and the fact that Edwards had alluded to Cheney's daughter, Mary, in the debate, who is a lesbian and was out as a lesbian. The fact that would even bring that up, Cheney said, the guy's a scumbag. Now, I don't know if anywhere in all of oral history you have a president or vice president describing one of his competitors as a scumbag, and one of Cheney's handlers, so to speak, when I was there for the after said, you want to take that back? And he said, hell no, I'm not taking that out. I want that in there. So if nothing else, you'll get to hear something unlike anything you've ever heard before in just that one interview. I'm going to be one of the speakers at the next session talking about substantively Bush's elections, and so I'll postpone any presentation on that until 11 o'clock or so, whenever we're up next.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, it's so good to be here with all of you this week. I'm really looking forward to everyone's presentations. Again, commend Hofstra and Meena and everyone on putting together a really amazing week of events. I was asked just to tell you a few things about the Bush Library. It's been my life now for 6 years. I've been in Dallas helping put that library together. As you heard when Meena introduced me, I've been around the library system for a while, starting at the Reagan Library when I was a very, very young archivist many years ago, and then I was in Washington for many years with the Central Office of Libraries. I feel like that whole time I've been involved in helping make information available. That's kind of our core mission at the National Archives, is to make information available. Even when I worked with Senator Baker in Tennessee, a great man who sadly we lost last year, part of our job there at the Baker Center was to collect and make available archives of modern Tennessee political leaders. So that has been my life from the beginning. Now, looking at the Bush Library now, all 13 presidential libraries, that's what we do, make that information available in 3 big ways. First of all, we do a lot in educational and public programs. Conferences like this, we work to put together curriculum for schools, we do teacher workshops, those types of things, all around the teaching of history and civics, how public policy is made, and very fundamentally, how to use primary sources in teaching and in research. So that's an important thing we do. Secondly, of course, we have the museum, and I would love for all of you to come to Dallas to see our permanent museum exhibit and our special exhibits. We've had over 700,000 people go through since we opened to the public on May 1st of 13. Very fascinating project, by the way, to put together an exhibit to try to tell the story of this administration and all the amazing things that happened during those 8 very consequential years. But again, at the end of the day, that museum is about providing information. And then, of course, we have the archives. We preserve and make available the records of the presidency of George W. Bush. I have a staff of just around 40 National Archives employees, plus contractors and over 300 volunteers. But in that 40, we have a core staff of 19 archivists, archives technicians, our archival department who are responsible every day for preserving, arranging, describing, and reviewing and making available an immense amount of records. They operate under something called the Presidential Records Act, and I won't bore you with all the details of that. But just to say, it tells us a couple things. First of all, it says that everything a president creates or receives as part of his official, statutory, ceremonial duties, official duties as president, automatically comes to the National Archives at the end of his administration. This wasn't always the case. For presidents up to President Nixon, those presidents would deed over their papers to their presidential library. So there was a deed of gift, private property being deeded to the National Archives. When President Nixon left office, his papers were seized. There was litigation for many years with the president saying that the government had seized his private property without compensating him for it. And that wasn't resolved until the early 2000s, believe it or not. But the Watergate and the resignation of Nixon made Congress think about how do we handle presidential records in the future. So they passed the PRA in 1978, which again gives ownership to us, the American people, when the president leaves office. Now, he can still have purely personal records, purely political records that are handled separately, but those official records belong to us. That PRA also says that after 5 years, anyone on the planet can submit a Freedom of Information Act or FOIA request to see the records. So we essentially have a 5-year breathing spell to figure out what do we have, gain intellectual control, as we say, and to begin the process of reviewing those records. We also, in those 5 years, have to handle a lot of what are called special access requests. So the current president, the former president, the Congress, and courts can ask within that first 5 years to see the records, and we have to respond. We responded to hundreds of those requests. Our 5-year period ended on January 20th of 2014, and so since then we have been accessible to the public through the Freedom of Information Act. Now, the collections we have at Bush are truly amazing, of course, because of their subjects, their complexity, but as well for their volume. And that volume occasionally keeps me up at night when I think about how much stuff we have in the archives. And when I was an archivist at the Reagan Library, when we were first starting up there, we only had to worry about paper records and audiovisual records. At the Bush Library, we do have paper records, around 70 million pages of paper records. But what makes us really different from other presidential libraries is our electronic collection. We have around 80 terabytes of electronic information, including, among other things, about 4 million digital photographs and over 200 million emails. If we were to print out all the emails, which we will never do, that would total roughly 1 billion pages. So in emails alone, we have more records, more pages of records than all the other presidential libraries combined by far. To give you an idea of how quickly this has changed, whereas we have 80 terabytes of information, the Clinton Library, our most recent predecessor, has 4 terabytes. So in a very short amount of time, the whole world of archives have changed. And of course, the Obama Library, when that's set up, will have much, much more than us. Now, the National Archives knew this was happening and set up something called the Electronic Records Archive, or ERA. We love acronyms, so I'm sorry I throw those around a lot, to store these and other electronic records. Our task now at the Bush Library is to process these records and make them available to you electronically in a timely way. And again, that poses some significant challenges for us because of the volume. Within the first week of being open to FOIA requests at the Bush Library, we had more records requested than they have processed at the Reagan Library in 25 years. So that is, again, a huge challenge for my archival crew. We have, the National Archives has created something called the Online Public Access Catalog, or OPA, where when we do process these electronic records and open them, they will be posted there. But that too has been a slow process of getting that system together and getting records posted on there. I will always note, though it may sound different, I am not complaining. These records are an immense, amazing resource for scholars and students. As you heard, presidents don't tape themselves anymore, but their staff sure send emails. So if you really want to understand how this White House worked, who was working with whom on what project, you have it here in these emails as we process them. This president dealt with an enormous number of crises, and you've heard this already, you'll hear it all week, starting with 9/11, ending with the financial crisis. In between, you have 2 wars, Katrina, so many things happening. We have the records at the Bush Library to explain how this administration reacted to those events and essentially forming the analysis of that administration in the future. So I'm very proud of the fact that we are the place to go to study those issues. That, of course, was the whole idea of the presidential library system in the first place. FDR came up with the idea many years ago because he wanted to make sure those records were preserved for that type of analysis in the future. He looked at earlier presidents and realized too often they go home with their papers, and over time they would get lost or stolen or burned up, those types of things. They were scattered. He didn't want that to happen, so he built and gave over that first library to the National Archives. Now, looking at what we're doing in Dallas, so far we've processed and notified roughly 710,000 pages. So we're just at the tip of the iceberg. Notify, I should explain, under the PRA, the incumbent president and the former president still retain certain rights of executive privilege. So let's say you come in and you ask for a FOIA request and it's 10,000 pages, and we get through that 10,000 pages. We review it under the PRA. There are different restrictions and exemptions we have to apply for national security, personal privacy, and so forth. But once we get through that process, let's say we redacted things, we've done what we have to do at the National Archives, then we have to notify the incumbent president and former President Bush and say, we're going to release these records. And they then have 60 days, if they wish, to claim executive privilege to close some or all those records. And they have to go through that process. So far, we've gone through that with about 710,000 pages and have put those out there. We have big goals this year in processing. We'll do at least 500,000 pages this year. My crew gets upset when I say more than that. I think they'll do more than that. But they are working very, very hard every day in a variety of formats to get those records open. So far, of my 19 archival crew, I have one still doing systematic review, essentially picking topics we know are important and trying to go through those records. But most of them now are just responding every day to different FOIA requests. And I think by the end of the year, they all will be doing that. Now, I should note for you, there were some records opened during the administration, some documents and a lot of photographs. Those are on our website. So if you go to georgewbushlibrary.smu.edu, we have the frozen White House website on there. So there are some documents and a whole bunch of photographs that you can find on that frozen website. And we do have other records in our archival collection as well. We provide reference on the Bush gubernatorial records. We have those at the Bush Library, held there in partnership with the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. It's been a great partnership, and so we do provide reference on those. And we also hold in courtesy storage pre- and post-presidential records from President and Mrs. Bush that we hope one day to have a deed of gift for. And then we're now very, very early on in the process of starting to solicit collections from other major associates of the President and Mrs. Bush. And of course, we're very interested in oral history, what's going on at the Miller Center. Of course, they always do a spectacular job there. and what Jeff and Michael and others are doing at the Center for Presidential History at SMU. That center has been a terrific partner for the library. We not only love the oral history efforts, but we do a lot of public programming with them as well, bringing a lot of speakers looking at presidential history. So again, at the end of the day, I see my job as director of the library is to provide information, and I'm really proud of what we've done so far at the Bush Library. I hope you enjoy the conference, and I'm glad to answer your questions.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks.
We've heard so many valuable insights here about the process of studying the Bush presidency and some of the issues. And I'd like to raise just a few questions on both of those topics, and then we'll open it up for audience questions as well. I'm going to begin actually with, I think, a question that bridges process and substance for all three of you. The Bush presidency, from the 2000 election, which I know, Michael, you'll be discussing in the next session, so I don't want to take too much from it, but this was a controversial presidency from the outset, right? From the question of legitimacy with the 2000 election, the day of fire of 9/11, and the subsequent days of fire. The controversial, often the polarizing topics, right, in this presidency, from combating terrorism, interrogation policies, enhanced interrogation, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, national security policy, international law, economic policy, the tax cuts to the financial crisis, education, immigration, Katrina, Medicare prescription drugs. So this is a presidency that I think it was, who's used the phrase consequential, right? A highly consequential presidency and a highly controversial presidency. My question is this, I guess it's two, what is the suitable time frame for evaluating those decisions in foreign policy, economic policy, domestic policy? Is there still a story to be written as these policies unfold? When President Bush left office, I think his Gallup polls were in the mid-20s. When the Bush Presidential Library opened in the spring of 2013, there were polls that recorded an uptick. Since then, I know we have some scholars in the audience who have been putting together surveys of presidents. Justin Vaughn has done, I don't know if Justin's here yet, but it has done that. And Bush is toward the bottom right now. Is that something, has President Bush's legacy been written? And what may change those assessments? However you'd like to begin.
I'll start. I know you guys will have much better comments on this, but for me as an archivist at heart, I believe you can start telling the story. And certainly Peter's book is spectacular in that regard, in terms of doing interviews and using what documentation is available. But in the long run, the real story of this administration is written when we do our work at the Bush Library and start opening these records. I think, looking over time, I've been in the library system, as you heard, most of my career. You get a much, much more balanced and understanding view of that presidency, no matter what your political thoughts are. I've seen throughout my career, you see that these presidents all of them deal with very difficult issues that change our country and can change the world, and you get a much more of a sympathy for what they're going through when you look at these records and you see, despite your political beliefs, they are trying their best to address these issues in the way they think correct for the future of our country. So when you start opening these records, that's been my thought over time. That's what you see. But we're slowly getting there, and I think that's when you can really write that story. I will tell you, you're reminding me of all these different topics. We have to start telling that story a little bit at the museum because we have the exhibit. And that's a challenge every presidential library has at the beginning of how do you encapsulate all these issues and these events, and how do you tell them in the correct way? We did that at the Bush Library when you come down to see the museum. Of course, you have a president's perspective, and that's part of the story, right? I mean, we need to think about that and understand what he was thinking during these events and when he was making these policies. But also, we try to provide some of the other side of the story. We have something called the Decision Points Theater, named after his book, in which we talk about the surge in Iraq, the decision to go into Iraq, the response to Hurricane Katrina, the response to the financial crisis, and we look at the debates that were going on around then of what you should or should not do. And it's all done kind of in a fun way where you act like the president and you're getting advice from different sources, but at the end of the day, it's a very serious thing, and that we're able to frame those debates and to say what people were saying at the time about the surge, for example. So that we have to start telling the story a little bit ahead of time. That's part of our educational mission. But at the end of the day, I think the real story is only written in later years as those archives become available.
One thing that is, we look at presidents with all the benefit of hindsight, and one of the things that I think comes to mind when we think of the George W. Bush presidency is the extent to which it was dominated by matters of war. But when you go back to 2000 and the campaign that won him the Republican nomination and ultimately led to his election as president, however disputed, however controversial the way in which that counting of the votes came about, Bush ran a campaign that was essentially devoid of national security content because the country simply wasn't focused on that. He was running as a governor of a state who had dealt with issues of education and juvenile justice and other issues that the country was more focused on because the world didn't seem a very threatening place from the vantage point of the year 2000. He ran as a compassionate conservative who really did feel like one of the problems that his party had is that it had become so hard-edged on matters of dealing with people with deep problems. And he wanted to bring conservative solutions to problems that historically had been the domain of liberals. And I think that carried over. By the way, one of the things you did a conference on Bill Clinton last year. One of the things I think that happened in the Clinton presidency that made that kind of compassionate conservative campaign in 2000 possible in the Republican Party is the enactment of welfare reform during Clinton's fourth year in office. Congressional Republicans, president essentially took what had been an entitlement program and turned it into a time-limited program whose purpose was to lead into work. And that took an issue that Republican conservatives had used for years, Ronald Reagan attacking, the welfare queens and all these lazy people. And when welfare reform was enacted in 1996 under the Clinton presidency, that was the end of that as an issue. And so George W. Bush could run not just as a conservative in 2000, but as a compassionate conservative who cared about the problems of those suffering in our society. And even during his presidency, even when it became a wartime presidency, he created what still is the largest program of aid to Africa, and in particular to a continent dealing with the rapid spread of AIDS, and that's the PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, which, by the way, had no political constituency at all. But it really sort of was a way, even while he was becoming a wartime president in the aftermath of 9/11, of indicating that he still had some of that animating spirit that enabled him to run and be nominated and be elected the first time around.
And Michael, I'm sorry, just to jump in real quick, Peter. It's interesting to think when we put our exhibit together, that beginning focus on domestic policy that's a story we did want to tell. This president came in wanting to focus on those issues. So when you first go in our museum after a section on the 2000 election, we, by the way, do have hanging chads and a little vial and a voting machine from Palm Beach County all talk about the 2000 election. But the first big section is on No Child Left Behind, faith-based initiatives, tax reform, that type of thing. Mrs. Bush's focus on literacy, even bringing T-ball to the South Lawn. All these things were the areas of focus when he took the presidency. And then you turn a corner and see a 22-foot piece of steel from the World Trade Center and all the events of September 11th, and everything very radically changes in the design of the exhibit, obviously, as it did in our nation on September 11th. So that is indeed reflected in our museum.
Let me just say one thing quickly, that we have an election machine that a political science alum from Hofstra ordered on eBay, donated to the political science department chair. And it is in our, the 9th floor exhibit, Points of Perspective, with an envelope with a little bag of hanging chads.
Oh, very
so
good.
We have history here.
Very good.
Peter,
you're the one who has all the ballots that were, so, okay. Look, history, it's not a concrete thing. It changes. History evolves with our times. We look at presidents from the past through the lens of today. right? We've seen this happen again and again and again. Truman, Eisenhower, all these presidents who were dismissed on some level or denigrated on some level, then have moments of revival and reappraisal. Even Nixon and LBJ, both of whom had, terrible endings to their presidencies, right? Have moments where we appreciate more, okay, we focus more on Nixon's foreign policy or on how LBJ got the Civil Rights Act through. The LBJ library in Austin a year ago did a whole big program trying to focus on what LBJ did domestically, even despite the continuing controversy over Vietnam that marks his legacy. When Clinton left office, when Bill Clinton left office, 2/3 of Americans said in a poll that he would be most remembered for scandal, not accomplishments. And today, I dare any of these, ask these kids in Hofstra University if they could tell us about Whitewater or the Travelgate or what the cattle futures scandal was all about. It's changed, right? Our view of Clinton has changed today. Our view of Reagan has changed today, right? People talk about Reagan today, and Rollins can tell us this, and he's well regarded across party lines. Democrats will tell you good things about Reagan too. At the time, it was a pretty polarized moment. I mean, a lot of Democrats didn't like him pretty viscerally, just like a lot of Republicans didn't like Clinton very viscerally. So over time, our views soften. We do tend to understand them better, appreciate the things that they did, while not necessarily laying off the hook for the things that they didn't do or didn't do well. And I think you've seen that with President Bush a little bit. His numbers are higher. I don't know where they are today. At one point, they were in the high 40s. At one point, they were slightly higher than President Obama's, which I think some Republicans took solace from. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is the distance of time. The moment of anger and passion and the fury of politics fades. And I think his post-presidential behavior, conduct is of staying relatively quiet, not being a figure out there commenting all the time. I think people have appreciated that, even Democrats. I think he looks differently partly because to liberals who didn't much like him, they view him favorably today compared to, say, Tea Party Republicans, right? They might not like Bush on Iraq, they may not like Bush on some things, but they remember he did actually support immigration reform, which today's Republicans are less supportive of. They do remember PEPFAR. I think conservatives who didn't like President Bush, who were disaffected from him, and remember the Tea Party movement, in fact, really has its roots in President Bush's time and the anger over deficits and the bailouts that but Bush was not a deficit hawk per se. But I think a lot of conservatives who kind of grew and alienated from President Bush during his time, some have come home because they liked President Obama a lot less. And they remind them, oh, that's a president we really don't like. I think that President Obama, to some extent, validates some of what President Bush did on national security, right? We talk about President Bush's controversial things he did on national security, the issues of torture, detention, surveillance. Did they go too far in curtailing our liberties? What we forget is he changed a lot of that by the time he left office. This is why he and Vice President Cheney were often at odds toward the end. President Bush moderated a lot of the harshest edges of his program by the time he left office, so that when President Obama ran against President Bush, he really ran against President Bush's first term and inherited President Bush's second term. And by that I mean, he had gone to Congress and gotten bipartisan approval of the surveillance program. There wasn't any waterboarding after 2003. All the controversial stuff we saw in the CIA report just last fall had all ended by 2006, 2007, before President Bush left office. He's the first one who tried to actually begin to move people out of Guantanamo. He actually shifted more inmates out of Guantanamo than President Obama has. Now, in President Obama's defense, the hard ones were the ones left behind. But in other words, President Bush understood that to have a sustainable legacy, he had to kind of create a more bipartisan consensus around some of the policies he was going to leave behind. And President Obama basically did, while making some changes and modifications, adopt a lot of the things, including like the drone program, that President Bush had left him. So I think that shapes his legacy and may change the way he's viewed on some level. And then the last thing I would say is we're about to have another election with another Bush. That will play a big role in deciding how we look at his brother, right? 2 years ago, 3 years ago, if you had asked me, could Jeb Bush run a plausible campaign for president, I'd have bet you no, right? A lot of us, I think, would have bet you no. It would have seemed inconceivable. The last president, who wants another Bush? Very unpopular. How can we go through this again? He'll just be, sucked into that vortex, and people will say, absolutely not. That still may happen, obviously. His brother and his father, even to some extent, are still issues he will have to deal with. He may not win the Republican nomination, much less the general election. But the very fact that he's out there as a credible, plausible candidate, and in fact the front runner, arguably in some early polls, it probably don't mean too much, but at least a putative front runner, that's an extraordinary change from 5-6 years ago when his brother left office. So it does show how things change. If Jeb Bush were to run and lose because people say enough, we don't want another George W., that would tell us one thing. If he performs well, even if he doesn't win, that would tell us another. So time does change these things.
Okay, thank you. And you're reminding me with that last point about the 2016 election, where the first candidate officially announced yesterday,
Yeah.
Senator Cruz. We're finding, I think, from a scholarly perspective, an increasingly difficult time to discuss governance, because elections are intruding sooner and sooner. When we were planning this conference, we said we won't do it in a presidential election year. We'll avoid a congressional midterm election year. So then that leaves you 2 odd-numbered years. We said we'll move it to March, not April, before anyone announces. But
Nice
it's
try.
getting harder and harder. I'm beginning to think we may in the future have to just kind of tell presidents and ask presidents and their advisors to come to Long Island as soon, January 21st. That may be our best bet for a discussion of governance.
That may not work either.
It may not. And I didn't mention earlier that President Bush's office was most gracious in, they've been enthusiastic about this conference, very helpful, and we've been appreciative of that. In fact, one of our speakers later this week saw President Bush last week and said, oh, he's very excited about it. So that was nice to hear. At any rate, I want to move to, this is a question really for Peter and Michael, and then I have a related question for Alan about Vice President Cheney, because you can't understand the Bush presidency without understanding the role of Vice President Cheney. I mean, that's the title of your book, Peter. You start your book with the Libby pardon, and this last question that is troubling President Bush before he leaves office, the request from Vice President Cheney. Michael, I didn't know the story about the interview that you did with the Vice President for the Oral History Project, and it's fascinating to me, this point about doesn't care about public opinion polls. And it reminds me of the prologue of Peter's book talks about breaking China, right? And how, I think it was Condoleezza Rice who said that to you, that the Vice President in the second term would have liked to have kept breaking China, to keep turning things upside down, doing what he believed, or what he believed was in the interest of the country. How do we reconcile the Vice President's goals, his lack of ambition for the presidency, but his clear ambition for policy making with democratic accountability? He says, one of Peter's chapters says, I was elected too, right? In the second term, he's feeling a little sidelined by Condoleezza Rice as Secretary of State. But you seem to have this interesting tension where a vice president who doesn't care about public opinion, but is the only other elected official in the executive branch, and has a very clear policy agenda well before 9/11. I mean, comes into office, and there's some debate about whether Cheney was interested in the vice presidency when he was chairing the selection committee. Barton Gelman's book, Angler, discusses some issues there. But this is someone who clearly, I think Peter said this, he has a very clear understanding of how Washington works and how to get things done. And from a policy perspective, there's much to laud there. How do you reconcile that with democratic accountability?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm really glad Michael brought up the point that Cheney came into office not aspiring to the Oval Office, because that is an unusual circumstance, really. If you look back, you have to go back to, I think, Charles Dawes, who was Coolidge's vice president, to find one who didn't sort of think he should be president on some level or another. And at first, I think, it gave him power. At first, it gave him, it enhanced his influence, because let's face it, if you're a president and you got a vice president there who's angling for your job, there's always going to be some subterranean kind of suspicion, or, often vice presidents are rivals, right, that you just finished beating in a presidential campaign. And the guy is sitting there getting ready for his campaign. He's thinking about Iowa. He's thinking about New Hampshire. And you're thinking as a president, well, what can you do for me, right? President Clinton and Vice President Gore are a great example. I mean, on the surface, there was this sort of bonhomie between these two young Southern guys of the New South, blah, blah, blah. But, it's like California. Beneath the surface, there are these tectonic plates, and they're kind of rubbing up against each other, right? And that was this friction, and particularly at the end between Clinton and Gore, was powerful and destructive. So Cheney had that advantage. Bush trusted him, I think, in a way previous presidents didn't have in their vice presidents, because Cheney had subordinated himself completely to his president. I think over time, though, you can make the argument, and some of Cheney's people made this argument to him, that his disregard for his own public polling, for instance, while admirable on the level of being, in effect, principled, not craven, the way we might see politicians, was also self-destructive. Because at a certain point in a democracy, if you want to make your points, if you want the policies that you care very much about, and he did care very much and still does about these policies, you have to make a case for them. You do have to ultimately get consent of the governed, right? And I think some of his people at one point said to him, well, sir, have you looked at your poll ratings? No, I don't care about them. And they came to the conclusion, as aides did, that it got taken too far, that you had to go out and explain yourself and answer questions and describe why you're doing the things you do and make the case publicly for why it's important to do the things you do. Otherwise, you lose the opportunity to make those permanent changes. And I think that in some ways that's why you do see Vice President Cheney, since leaving office, more vocal than he was during office. He now feels liberated. He told people that. I feel liberated. And in some ways, I think his battle with Obama over these last 5 or 6 years is in some ways kind of a proxy for his quiet, private battle he'd had inside the White House with Bush in the second term as Bush moved away from the policies that Cheney had advocated. So I think it's a great question.
Peter Baker, in his opening remarks, mentioned the fact that the vice presidency began to become an office of real influence in the Carter administration, the Jimmy Carter administration, and Walter Mondale, his vice president, being that relationship being the defining relationship that's created the vice presidency as we see it today, which is no longer a joke. That's also the beginning of an era in which the country turns away from Washington insiders in electing its president. So governors like Carter and Reagan and Clinton and George W. Bush, Barack Obama, clearly not a Washington insider, even though he was a senator. The one exception, the elder George Bush. And when these Washington outsiders are nominated by their parties for president, they invariably choose a Washington insider as their running mate. It's in part a way of reassuring the voters that they're getting somebody on the ticket who sort of knows how the federal government works from the inside. Cheney was the ultimate in that way. He was very unusual, unique even, in having no presidential ambitions, but he was, to an extraordinary degree, experienced in Washington. He had been the youngest White House chief of staff in history to President Gerald Ford. He had been the number 3 ranking Republican in the House Republican leadership while he was in Congress. He had been Secretary of Defense in the first Bush administration. This was somebody who knew Washington, all the subterranean networks of power and influence, probably more deeply from experience than any president, much less vice president, in history. And George W. Bush got the good out of that. But as Peter points out in his book, to characterize that as a static relationship is to miss what we know from every other area of life, which is that relationships evolve. And as George W. Bush became more sure-footed, more comfortable, more confident in his own command of the networks of power in Washington, naturally he was less dependent on Vice President Cheney. And when issues came up, where in the first term Cheney probably would have gotten his way with the president, well, now the president didn't feel that same sense of, well, he knows what he's talking about and I don't. He still thought Cheney knew what he was talking about, but he thought that he knew what he was talking about too, and after all, he was the president. Now, Biden The Biden-Obama relationship is curious in its own way because Biden, although I don't think he's been taken seriously by anybody else as a potential presidential candidate in 2016, has sort of never let go of that as an option in his own mind. And I don't know the extent to which that has colored either his conduct of the office or his relationship with Barack Obama. Famously, of course, he got way ahead on his skis in endorsing same-sex marriage when Obama was getting ready to do that, and sort of put the president in the position of following rather than leading. That is not a position presidents ever want to be in relation to their vice presidents. But that's another story for another conference.
I'm going to ask one more question. I have a question for Alan about Cheney and records, and then I think we'll open it up for audience questions. Alan, when you told us how many, the 80 terabytes of electronic material, I'm starting to think I barely sent any emails for this conference at all. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, and I'm so glad I'm not the person who has to process this. But do you think, substantively, we know, in studying the archives and the oral histories, we know that the documents can be tremendously revealing, that Eisenhower's hidden hand presidency, Fred Greenstein went to the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas, planning to write a chapter in a book on the modern presidency about Eisenhower as a passive president, found as the records were coming out in the early 70s, a very different portrait, and that led to his book, The Hidden Hand Presidency. A question I have specifically with Cheney in our discussion, what Peter and Michael were saying, do you think these emails and these records, will they add substance to our understanding of the vice president's decisions in the days after 9/11, the executive orders, the surveillance programs? Are they information or are they resources, I guess, is a question.
I think both, and I should note that we do not have the vice presidential records at the Bush Library, the Cheney records. Those are held in Washington. Under the Presidential Records Act, the vice presidents have the authority to determine where their records end up. They're still covered by the Presidential Records Act and protected by that, but Vice President Cheney, Vice President Gore, and others can make that decision of where those records go. At this point, they're still in our central office in Washington. If in the future, any of the vice presidents covered by the Presidential Records Act decide, well, I want those records to go here, that location has to be approved by the Archivists of the United States, and they still have to abide by the FOIA rules and security rules that all the rest of us abide by. When I was with Senator Baker for many years, I spoke a few times to Vice President Gore, begging him to give me his vice presidential records to go to the Baker Center. If he'd ever said yes, I don't know what I would have done. I didn't have the staff to process them or the security holdings area to put those records in, but I sure gave it a good try. So in terms of your question, though, looking at both vice presidential and presidential, I think you have both. You have substance, and it gives us kind of a more nuanced view of the actions of an administration. As more and more records are open, you understand the complexities of the issues they faced and the complexities of the responses they gave, rather than just kind of the surface appraisal that we all have of any policy implementation. When you start digging into these emails, into the paper documents, and all the other records that we have, you see much, much more of the kind of the architecture of that decision. President Bush talks a lot about decision making, and when you start opening the things we have, you'll see all the different things that went into making that decision. And it wasn't a snap decision. None of these presidents make those snap decisions. A lot of resources, a lot of ideas, a lot of input goes into it, and at the end of the day, they make what they think is the best decision. That's what these emails give you. That's what our paper records give you. The emails also, though, I think give you a really fascinating glimpse inside the workings of a White House, because you not only get these substantive kind of policy debates, but you also get the emails that say, here are my comments on the speech. Would you like to go have a pizza later? So then you get those personal relationships that you can see of how people work together, which I think will be invaluable to scholars in the years to come.
Thank you. We have about 12 minutes here for questions, and I know we have microphones, and then there were note cards handed out. If people wanted to write something down, you'll be able to hand it to one of our staff members, and they'll bring them to me. We'll try to get in as many questions as we can before the 11 o'clock session. If you could just keep the questions concise, Questions, not comments, please, then we can move forward. I think, and we would like to get some student questions in, if possible. Why don't we begin? I think, Mr. Rollins, you have a question? Can you, hold on, let's just get the mic to you. Can we bring the mic down here? Thank you. Thank you.
This is just a minor correction, and I do it with all humility with the great panel you have here. Dick Cheney did have some presidential ambitions. He explored it in '96. He couldn't get any real support. He had a very serious heart problem in which people obviously said, business community and others, in '96 he was not going to beat Dole. But he did have political ambitions. He wanted to be Speaker initially. I was the chairman of the Congressional Committee, and I was going to build my Republican majority around him being the Speaker. He obviously went to defense at that point in time, but I think in the back of his head, at one point in time, as many people who are near the Oval Office do have ambitions. So I don't think you can say he did not have any presidential ambitions. I think he basically changed course and realized he could have a lot of power without being the president, and obviously
That's a fair point and
Yep.
a very useful point. By 2000, though, those presidential ambitions clearly were in the rear view of his life rather than in the foreground.
Okay. Thank you. Other questions? One up here, and then we'll go to the back.
Good morning. Glenn Sussman, Old Dominion University. Each one of you have mentioned a number of issues that are relevant to what you call the consequential president, George W. Bush. And if there was one consequential issue during his presidency, it's environmental affairs. And I haven't heard that mentioned at all.
That's true.
And I was wondering if one or all of you might make just a general comment about that.
I'm sure I'll start, but we wanted to talk about that some in our museum. So when you come through, you'll see that we talk about the Ocean Action Plan and his work in the Pacific of putting aside a large area there in terms of marine preserves. So that is something we've talked some about. In terms of records open at this point, I don't think we've opened a lot regarding that, but it's something I would love if we have the leisure of doing systematic review, of doing more of those types of openings as well. But it is something we knew early on we wanted to talk about in the exhibit. We've even talked about how we kind of beef that up a little bit and make it a bit more interactive, because again, it is a story that's not told a lot, and we would like to do that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. It's an important issue, and certainly didn't mean to in any way neglect it. I think, in fact, it's one of the fascinating moments on the evolution of the Bush-Cheney relationship. In the beginning, of course, it's Cheney who convinces him to reverse himself on his campaign pledge to impose a cap on the emissions of power plants, something he had agreed to do in the 2000 campaign. Cheney famously comes into the Oval Office, gets him to sign a letter to some senators without having gone through the process, outmaneuvers his rivals like Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and Governor Christie Whitman. Sorry, exactly, Governor Whitman. And by the end, though, of the presidency, Bush is clearly having some second thoughts about his approach and how he's going to be remembered on this. His view of climate change changes over time, and by the time he leaves office, he's, I think, thinking about what the legacy will be like, and he agrees to give a speech in which he will essentially embrace a cap-and-trade option if Congress will send him one, which is a rather extraordinary change for him given what had happened. And Cheney fought it and didn't like it, lost. He thought it was a bad idea, inhibiting the energy industry. Cheney lost the argument, but in effect won the battle, because in the process of having lost the policy, his people helped rewrite the speech in a way that was so confusing in the way it was actually delivered that nobody actually realized the president had actually embraced a cap-and-trade plan. And the people who had been fighting for it inside the administration basically gave up. It was too late to refight the battle, and so he was kind of, he was left with a legacy that's probably not what he would have wanted, I think, on some level in that. I think he would argue that his focus on technology and investments in some of the clean energy thing has contributed to some of the moderation of climate gases. But there's obviously a lot of attention to the fact that industry had an open door in his White House, a very strong part of Cheney's energy task force from the beginning. Helped some of the people who'd been lobbyists were members of the White House staff, and so I think that you're right, it's an important issue that should be explored.
Let me just say that John Bridgeland is speaking tomorrow. He directed a cabinet-level review of climate change in the first year of the Bush White House, and he and I discussed how that could be a separate session. We did not get a single scholarly paper proposal on climate change policy, and we had an open call for papers distributed to departments across the country. Climate change and PEPFAR were the two topics that we have raised in various other sessions, but this was an open call for papers, and surprising, maybe people we're focused on the other issues, but they certainly do merit attention. Other question, I see one. Oh, let me try to get it over there, please. Yeah, go ahead.
First off, hello. It's a privilege to be able to hear you guys speak. Okay, so my question is, you spoke a lot about legacy earlier. Do you believe that the statement made by Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of Britain, that the Middle East peace process is the single most pressing political issue facing the world accurately reflected the Bush administration, and do the records reflect that? Thank you.
Well, the Middle East preoccupation of presidents back to Truman, I guess, has been with the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. And a lot of presidents and secretaries have stayed banged their head against that wall and with very limited success. The Middle East in the Bush presidency comes to mean something very different and becomes sort of folded into this general concern about defending the United States against terrorist groups that are stateless like the Palestinians, but that are capable of extending their violence onto within our borders. So I think traditional Middle East concerns with Israel and Palestine, not that the Bush administration didn't care about them or didn't pay any attention to them, but they just fell further down the list of preoccupations when you had the immediate and ongoing and urgent concern about terrorist groups that are based in some way in states that are Middle Eastern.
Yeah, if I could add real quickly, I think President Bush came in feeling quite jaundiced about the whole Middle East peace process, having watched specifically his predecessor, Bill Clinton, on the way out the door, try and fail to bring the parties together. And in fact, Bill Clinton calls Colin Powell the night before the inauguration, I think, and says, don't trust Arafat, he's a liar, you can't trust him, basically. So I think the administration came in quite feeling like, we're not going to get caught in that briar patch. We're not going to sit there and waste a lot of our energy on that. But there's a really interesting philosophical disagreement inside the administration and inside Washington generally, and Ambassador Negroponte knows this better than I do, but of the relationship or not between Middle East peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians and that larger terrorism threat. And there are a lot of people who criticized the administration, said, look, you have to solve that or at least address that in order to fight terrorism. These are not unrelated things. And as long as there's this festering conflict, you will not end up solving the broader radicalism problem. And a lot of people inside the Bush administration didn't see it that way and thought that was not, they didn't see the linkage in that way. And there was a big fight about that that played out over 8 years.
That's what I was going to say. In terms of the records, obviously it is reflected there. And that philosophical debate, I think, is going to be one of the more interesting things to see as we open more and more records, how that was reflected in the White House. But also, I can't forget there are other federal records, State Department and so forth, that are maintained in Washington. Seeing how those discuss that topic as well over time as they're released, I think will be really interesting.
Actually, Alan, that picks up on a quick question I had been meaning to ask you. As we study the Bush presidency, Obviously, we start at the Bush Presidential Library, but
Yes.
you brought up the National Archives in DC.
Right.
And then other archives where people may choose, is that, to deposit papers? So
Right.
how far can we go to have a comprehensive portrait of the Bush presidency?
I think first and foremost, the Bush Library, of course, is where you come first and do research there. And as I said earlier, we not only have presidential, but all his gubernatorial records as well. But yes, you have to go to the National Archives in Washington to look at those federal records that they have there. There's also something called the Center for Legislative History there in Washington, Legislative Archives, I should say. And they maintain the 9/11 Commission reports, for example, those types of things. So National Archives in Washington, invaluable resource, Bush Library, and then we'll see where other collections end up. I hope a lot of them end up at the Bush Library, but they may end up at other facilities as well.
So they're all public records, but the individuals have choice?
No, some of those will be private collections. They're private records that I would hope they would donate to us under a
Okay.
deed of gift, but they may go to other institutions.
Whose do you want most, other than Cheney's?
I'm sorry?
Whose do you want most, other than Cheney's?
Oh, there are a bunch on there. I'm not gonna jinx that, Peter. But we have a list. We have a list of folks we would like to approach.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. If we go here? No, up to the front. Thank you.
As far as collecting emails, you were talking about
Yeah.
trying to sift through emails.
Yes.
How difficult is it going to be to try to sift out Hillary Clinton's emails?
Well, I will say, in terms of our email issue, it's been a real challenge. That's the word I use a lot, I know, but it's true. First of all, how do you preserve these things and be able to access them not only now, but in 50 years? And that's why they put together the ERA, the Electronic Record Archive, that supposedly gives us that type of access. So at least, first of all, you figure out how do I preserve it. Then how do I process it is what we're still kind of struggling with because of the volume. We know we can go in, we can electronically process the record, but how you do so much, I'm a real proponent of thinking how we use technology in that in the future so that our archivists don't necessarily have to review every page line by line like they do now, because this gets beyond, they could triple my archival staff and we still would be overwhelmed. And then how do you make it available electronically? We're still struggling a bit with that, but we're getting there as an agency where the online public access catalog will be able to allow us to do that. So that is in terms of that. For Secretary Clinton's records, I'm going to leave that alone other than saying I know that they have asked for clarification from the State Department of how those records were maintained. The archivist has done that, but we'll see what happens in that.
And if I can just ask a follow-up with that, I mean, Secretary Clinton worked in the Obama administration. You're dealing with the predecessor. What were the rules on email at the time, during the Bush
those were all
era?
preserved. And you know, our office in Washington, the Office of Presidential Libraries, has kind of a subunit that now it's its own standalone unit that works with the White House from the very beginning. And they help store materials during the administration because there's simply not enough space at the White House complex. But also they talk to them about records issues. And you know, there's information sent out, here's how you should maintain your records. Please recognize if you do this, it becomes a presidential record. So when you send that email saying, do you want to have dinner? If you send it on this system, it's going to be archived. It's going to be a presidential record forever. So those are the records. And certainly as a federal employee, I know I'm now trained a lot in how I'm supposed to maintain my emails. So if my sister emails me, I can mark it as non-record, but if I do that, it's automatically archived after so many days. So those are maintained in that way.
Well, we are now moving from our first plenary into 4 concurrent panels at 11:10, and all of our sessions match up as much as we can with our class times to maximize student participation. But we will have a panel here now on political communication, in the East Multipurpose Room on elections, on policymaking and public communication in China and North Korea in the Plaza Rooms, and a student session on the success and failure of the conflict in Afghanistan in the Cultural Center Theater. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and let's continue the discussion.
Are you tied up after You doing something?
I'm doing something, I think you are, right?
Yeah.
The next one, I don't think I did.
You want to have lunch?
Yeah.
That went well. Good.
Sure.
Sure. Why not?
Ginny, I can.
Trying to get up to our, trying to get up to our
You know,
terabyte.
one of my closest
Yeah,
friends
can you-
is
Oh,
Bill
great,
Halton.
perfect. Thank you, Ginny.
Wrote a biography. You know about this?
I don't. A power baker, okay.
He was a former student and close friend of
Carl Pierce. Excellent. Good job, man.
So appreciative of you coming today, Steve.
10,000 pages of
But, I mean,
process.
my
They
thoughts.
have 60 days prisoner drama.
Yes, oh, of course. Of
Exercise
course, yes.
privilege.
And our
They
speakers,
didn't
yes.
say it, did they? Have
They have.
nothing.